enjoying the process of talking to people about social systems and the way in which social systems affect human behavior. And so decided sociology would be a great way to share that with professional sociology would be a great way to share that with students particularly. So I decided to move toward a career in academia. I got a master's degree at Marquette University in Milwaukee, and then did doctoral work at the University of Kansas in Lawrence, Kansas, where I wrote a dissertation that studied and focused on the sort of intersections between the nationalist movement in Ireland and Northern Ireland and broader sort of European political movements, which we don't need to go into at all. But that was sort of what gave me an interest in Ireland and in conflict, right? And particularly nationalist conflict, which was a really, really big topic in the late 90s when I finished my doctorate. And it was being studied by a variety of people I was working with at the University of Kansas. So went on the market and interviewed a number of places. Augustana was clearly the best fit for me, in part because there were opportunities to teach what I loved and to teach in Ireland and Northern Ireland. So I was at Augie for about a year before I was presented with an opportunity to design a study abroad course on conflict and reconciliation in Ireland, which we ran in 1990, 2000, and have run, I don't know, 20 times at least since I'm going back, teaching the course, or a variant of the course, I guess, again in 2000, next January, over our interim program.
Mm-hmm. What kinds of things are you engaged in right now as far as teaching at Augie?
Yeah, I teach classes in race and ethnicity. I teach a class in Native American history and culture. I teach sociological theory, and then I teach some courses in deviance and social control and criminal justice.
Mm-hmm. Well, to get into our subject, what do you think are the underlying causes for violence? It seems like it's everywhere. What are the kind of things that you think impact not only the amount of violence, but the quality of violence?
Yeah, I think that's a huge question, and there are any number of different facets that contribute to the onset of violence and the sort of protracted long-term characteristics of violence, as well as contribute to the things we can do to mediate violence or reconcile violence between communities. From my perspective as a social scientist and as a sociologist, I'm always interested in the sort of broader sort of social, systemic, and cultural elements that contribute to violence. So my interests in studying violence really come from or are informed by a kind of sociological perspective. And I think one of the most powerful sort of broad explanations for what causes violence is really a kind of disconnect between what the literature refers to as interests and needs, right? So we all have needs. We all have things like, we all have needs for identity. We all have needs for security, for protection, for recognition, for development, whether it's economic or otherwise. And those are things that typically aren't in short supply and can be equally distributed. Unless we come to the understanding, unless we somehow get to a point where we transform our understanding of those needs into what we might call interests. And when they become interests, right, then they're really controlled by things like power and inequality. And they become kind of a zero-sum game where, like, if you think about identity, the more I have, my identity is I'm able to have an identity to the extent that I don't step on your ability to have an identity, and vice versa. And to that extent, it's not mutually exclusive. It's not what we would call a zero-sum game. There's no limited supply of identity out there unless somebody prevents me from having my identity, or from having my resources, or from having my education, or for having a vote. When needs become interests, they become carved up in unequal ways. And that creates a situation where you get competition and power differences. Mm-hmm. And so can I?
Oh, you got stuck.
If I can riff on it's this stuff, right? I'll often bring a couple bags of cookies to class, and I'll do this little experiment where I divide students into two groups. They flip a coin. One group flips a coin twice. The next group flips a coin twice. We go back and forth. And whoever gets a matching set of heads or a matching set of tails, whichever team gets that, gets a cookie. The first team to 10 cookies gets 3 minutes to rewrite the rules of the game. Now, I've taught this any number of times, and at no time that I've taught it has the group that's gotten the power to rewrite the rules rewritten the rules in a way that equally distributes the cookies that are left over. They always pursue their interests over their needs. They always pursue the cookies as though they're a zero-sum game to be distributed based upon competition and inequality. So what causes that? And we have a conversation about why. Why did you automatically assume that you should rewrite the rules in a way that gave you an advantage over other people? And I think that comes down to our socialization, or what sometimes we call our default values, right? And in our culture, those default values are things like accumulation and competition and individualism. And that's not part of human nature. That's really part of just the way our culture socializes us to think about our relationships to others. And so I think when we think about conflict is often seeded, right? The seeds of conflict rest in that transformation of needs to interests, and then our competition with other people over making sure we have access to things that other people might not have.
Well, I think your example is a quite interesting one, and I think it's interesting because the experiment you did, I'm assuming because that's the only one I've heard you talk about so far, was in a school like Augie, and a school like Augie, or just going to school at any rate, that's already a select group of people in the sense that they are privileged.
Absolutely.
It's like many of them grow up with a certain kind of privilege. And so I'm wondering how much of that translates, because I know we've talked before about, I've lived in cultures where that's not the norm. That's not what people would do. And if you did that, if you approach life like that, well, you would kind of be ostracized. Maybe there's a couple of people who could be the Mogonaba or something like that. And that person is the chief and he's out of your life. You don't deal with him every day. But if you dealt like that with the people in your village, well, pretty soon when you needed to build your house, nobody would show up.
Right. It's a very, very different mindset or set of default values, right? And I think that having the opportunity to teach this to students who are in a privileged position is only an opportunity to remind them of that privilege, right? And how important it is to keep that understanding of those default values. So what have you been socialized to expect? And how does that inform your behavior in situations where we could distribute things potentially equally, right? And where we don't have to feel threatened. And that's part of it, right? When I think sometimes our default values lead us to think about things as threats that might not be all that threatening in the long run. And so you're absolutely right. I mean, I think it's an opportunity to remind them of the fact that they have, to inform them that critical thinking, that these are things that they need to be aware of as they move forward into their organizational life, into their career, so on and so forth, family relationships, and support for social policies from a broader perspective.
Sure. Can you talk now about how that leads to violence in our society?
Okay. Yeah, for sure. I mean, so as needs become transformed into interests, typically what happens is you get this competition over what are defined then as scarce resources, a zero-sum game. The more of something you have, the less of it I can get. And that pits groups against one another. And oftentimes the group that has access to changing the rules or rewriting the rules or revising the rules, right, gains the upper hand. And so in the conflict resolution literature, they call that asymmetric conflict, right? It's conflict where the two parties aren't equal. Symmetric conflict would be conflict where the parties are relatively equal. And in that situation, there's an opportunity to meet and talk about the rules and write the rules together. But as groups become more powerful or less powerful, when there's an asymmetry between groups, that tends to lead to what's called escalation, right? The conflict that emerges, right? The group with the power does whatever it can to control the resources that it's trying to control. And more importantly, the group without the power begins to see that violence is the only possible response they have to reacting to that inequality. Now that's kind of and we can talk a little bit about this if you want to. That's somewhat of a chicken and egg question, which comes first. Oftentimes they emerge equally at the same time.
So Talk a little bit more about that.
So I think that, if you look at the case of that I'm most familiar with, the conflict in Northern Ireland, right, between Catholics and Protestants, nationalists who want an independent island of Ireland, and unionists who want to maintain their connection to the UK, to the United Kingdom, right? There was this situation where because one side had the power of the crown behind it, it had access to rewriting the rules in all sorts of ways that disenfranchised the native Irish. So things like voting rights. If you were a Protestant, you got a second vote. So you got in Ireland and Northern Ireland historically, if you were a Protestant, you got a vote. If you were a male, you got a vote. If you owned property, you got a vote. If you owned multiple properties, you got a vote. If you were educated, you got a vote. And so all of these things came together to create this asymmetry between these two groups of people. Now, the group on top, right, the powerful group felt as though they needed to do that, right, to rewrite the rules in their own interests. The group at the bottom became increasingly unable to fight the system and to create equality and to have their needs met through normal political action, because the political system was against them. And so increasingly they came to see violence as not everybody, but many came to see violence as the only way of getting their way, of making a stand, of positioning themselves in such a way that their voices could be heard.
Could you talk a little bit about how that translates, not government to government or one like whole group to another, but between individuals? How does that translate?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, I think this we can think about this from a sort of broad, global, international politics perspective, but we can also think about it in terms of just sort of micro interpersonal relationships, right? When we're put in a position where we feel threatened about other, oftentimes, many times it emerges when, again, we begin to think about things that could be shared among all of us, like things like identity or economics in some cases, right, as a zero-sum game. And so suddenly then our default values kick in. And if our default values teach us that accumulation and competition, individualism, pursuing our own needs at the expense of other people's needs are the mechanism by which we should move forward, then it's very easy for us to begin to deny other people access to the same things we desire, right? Stability, identity, recognition, and so on and so forth. Because we see them as a zero-sum game. And we see if we grant someone else the ability to have those things, then we don't, for some reason, we feel like we don't have access to those things. And that pits us against one another.
It's a very interesting proposition. And I think it's particularly interesting relative to religion, because when we look at so many wars that were caused on the basis of religion, and it's a perfect case of there really is no zero-sum game, but people treat it as though, like if I allow you to sin, I will go to hell, or something like that.
Right. Or my unique practice of this particular faith somehow prevents you from your faith position. And you're absolutely right. That's a great example of the fact that, right, really those aren't in competition with one another, right? And yet often historically they've been treated as a threat. And difference is often treated as that kind of a threat. And so we perceive them. And again, it depends upon our default values, right? It depends upon our approach to understanding this. But when our approach is that I'm in competition with other people, that I'm looking after number one first, that I'm going to accumulate whatever I can, right? Whoever dies with the most toys wins, those kinds of things. But, then it pits us against, we tend to see them as a zero-sum game.
Yeah. Well, I think it's quite interesting when you look at how, if it's religion itself, if it's really about God, then there's a zero-sum game. But if it's about membership, then it actually is a zero-sum game. If this guy goes with you, maybe he's not with me. He's not on my side. He doesn't come to my service. He goes to your service, and it's all about how many butts I have in the seats, so to speak.
Right. And that's a real kind of interesting twist on religion, right? I mean, that's the point, right? It gets almost, the transformation of needs to interests really corrupts those needs and really influences us to think about things in ways that promote conflict and that promote potentially violence.
Okay. How might we use the kind of discovery that you're talking about in terms of explanation of how we got here? How might we use that information to start to unravel our potential to keep going in this loop or spiral down?
Yeah. That's a great question, and it's a difficult question because there are multiple facets to violence. There's the sort of physical violence that we talk about, but there's also structural violence where social systems are organized in such a way that they, prevent access to important needs. And there's also cultural violence, right? Ideas that are violent and that are portrayed socially through our culture and so on and so forth. I think that whenever you have an asymmetric situation, whenever you have a group that has more power than the other power, oftentimes it requires the intervention of some sort of third party. Now, that third party, and a third party that's neutral, right? So not a third party that takes sides, right? That doesn't work because that just contributes to greater asymmetry, right? But a party that can actually remain neutral, and oftentimes that kind of dynamic requires professional training in one way or another. So we can think about it at the broad sort of level of international politics. Oftentimes that has to do with diplomacy and diplomats who come in and use a variety of different strategies to connect with the parties in conflict or in violence with one another, and to create an awareness that violence doesn't serve anybody's purpose moving forward. So, for the top dog, for the people in power, the ongoing violence doesn't help. It's not a long-term solution or benefit to them. And on the other hand, to the underdogs, violence isn't a long-term solution either. So let's talk about what a solution could look like. And it takes a mediator or a diplomat that doesn't take sides to be able to convince both sides that there's a benefit to trying something different. And then there's all sorts of ways you can move through that, through different sort of tracks of diplomacy, working with everything from churches to community organizations, grassroots movements, as well as political groups to do that. On the interpersonal level, a lot of times it still involves a mediator. We don't talk about that as diplomacy. We talk about it as mediation. But for instance, couples who are separating, right, or in the process of divorce, often, or who are in the process of that, but want to avoid that and come to some sort of agreement, right, often need the help of a third party to be able to hold each side accountable, right, and to be able to help sort of bridge the realities, the default values of the two people or two groups together, to provide that bridge that makes them, think that, hey, when this group does this, this is what this group thinks about it, and vice versa. And provide a sort of neutral voice, again, that in the process can hold each other accountable to a shared set of rules, to a shared set of default values, in order to move forward, to reconcile that conflict, to end the violence if it's a violent relationship, or simply to come to some terms with understanding the other person and your disconnect with them.
To what extent does the success of such an effort depend on motivated players? In other words, there are sometimes, you see where someone sees that chaos is in their interest because they have an interest in getting something. And if people actually settle down and sort of start liking each other, then they can't put forward their interest of whatever they want to do. So how do you?
That's a really great question. Yeah, I don't know if I have the answer, but it's something that, again, an expert mediator looks out for, right? The goal of an expert mediator or diplomat is to create a kind of congruity between the perspectives of both sides of the conflict, and to create and to create a kind of buy-in, right, from both sides that are in conflict with one another, that moving away from conflict is the best option or the best strategy, or the best long-term strategy for both sides. And so you have to sort of create that, right? Expert mediators are able to create that in a way that gives buy-in to both sides. But you're absolutely correct. Both sides have to have some willingness to participate in a kind of give and take. If there's and we see that, for instance, I'll go back to Northern Ireland. We see that as the peace process unfolded in the late 1990s, what George Mitchell and the other diplomats did was create a big piece of legislation called the Good Friday Agreement. I won't go into all the dynamics of it, but what that, if you're interested, call me and we can talk more. But what that piece of legislation did was really create incentives for all of the parties involved in the violence to end their violence. And it created assurances to the nationalists in Northern Ireland that there would be ongoing connections between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, Southern Ireland. It also created alignments between Northern Ireland and the UK to but to bring the unionists on board. So there are all these political dynamics, all these sort of tentacles that were created that gave everybody an investment. They were going to get something they wanted, some assurance that they wanted, that didn't erode the other group's assurance, but would at least get them to participate in peace. Now, not everybody was on board with that. And there were fraction groups of the Irish Republican Army, for instance, and a variety of loyalist groups that continued in violence, right? Even because they felt like their interests still weren't being met, right? And so sometimes you get, those kinds of at a nationalist level, sometimes you get those kinds of fragmentation of groups that emerge. You get these sort of hawks who are very concerned about losing their interest and who aren't willing to engage in the peace process. What happened in Northern Ireland? Well, there's a lot that happened. One of the things that happened was once the public kind of got a taste of a nonviolent society, it was okay. They liked it. It was good, right? That's something I can support. And so the tables of public opinion began to turn against those groups that were on the fringes, who still felt like their interests weren't being met, and that violence was a necessary response to that. And that problem. So that happened in 1998. That problem is still not completely gone away. But you're talking about a conflict that's been going on for 800, 1200 years. Depends on when you sort of start the clock, right? And those things take a long time to reconcile.
Right. So that really points out that there are many people who, let's say, prod and poke and push people toward the violence, as you were saying before. And it seems like most of the people who are affected by it are completely unaware that they are being manipulated, to create this distrust, to create fear between people, to destabilize them, and it seems like some people actually they benefit from that, and they wouldn't have a place if it weren't for this violence going on. They wouldn't have a place. And I think that translates even to our personal lives, like within families. It's like there are some people, sometimes you'll have a member of the family who will keep things going all the time, or act as a tyrant, make everybody like live in fear and yelling and screaming, throwing things. So how does that play into the continuance of violence?
Yeah. In some ways, you're asking a question that's over my head. I'm not a psychologist, so I'm a little. I think you're correct. I think that there are at times people who, for whatever reason, see ongoing violence, ongoing conflict as a way of sort of supporting their identity and their role, either in a relationship or in a political system or what have you. And those are very difficult things to overcome, right? They require, in some cases, lots of therapy. If that person is even capable of seeing themselves as part of the problem, and many times they don't. What goes into that? I mean, again, I'm not trained in psychology, so I can't really speak to what it would take to overcome that. But you're right. I mean, that's one of the hurdles, right? Is to getting them to think about their default values, right, in a new way, and to think about the consequences of their default values, and then also a way to chart a way out of it, right? So if I am finding that this abusive relationship or whatever builds my esteem, or how do I find another avenue where I can build esteem that doesn't require this kind of thing to happen?
Good. I'd like to bring the rest of our group into this discussion now. Do any of you have, first, if you have any questions, clarifications, or even comments about what we've talked about so far? Did you get, your brains get frozen?
I'm good.
Well, while you're thinking about
This
it.
is a bit like a class at my university, right? Lawrence, you're not doing this right. You have to let you just have to pause. You have to let it, and sooner or later someone gets uncomfortable and speaks. You all aren't that much different than the 18-year-olds I have in class.
Somebody had something.
I'll jump in with a comment. I'm new to this group. I don't know if everyone else has been here before, but this is my first one. But I thought one of the interesting things you said was about asymmetric positions, that one group is disadvantaged relative to the other. And I think one of the I think a really interesting phenomenon that we might be observing in our current world is that there are two groups that each think they're in the inferior position. That there's not an agreement on who is disadvantaged relative to the other.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think that it goes back to a couple of things. I mean, again, it's a real interesting example, right, of the transformation of needs to interests. So we have, well, there's multiple examples of this, but we have groups of people in society who feel very clearly that if one group gets an advantage, it's a disadvantage for them, and vice versa. And a kind of unwillingness or inability or whatever to recognize that perhaps the advantages of one group are the result of disadvantages to another group. Now that the advantage group might not have created those advantages. Those advantages may have been created years and years ago, but that doesn't mean that we can't do something about them, right? And so it's this perception of threat from both sides. And that perception of threat often prevents groups from really talking to one another, communicating with one another, engaging in civil and civic discourse to clearly articulate what the needs are, and what the shared needs are as a result of this, and then being able to hear and listen. And we're not in a society right now where we have access to those kinds of things. I mean, this is a great forum, right? Because it provides an opportunity for us to have this conversation. Social media doesn't, right? It's just, there are numerous studies out there that show that we're, the great idea that Facebook and other forms of social media would improve civil society really isn't happening, right? Instead, we're bubbling ourselves, we're engaged in the sort of filter bubble effect where we're hearing only perspectives, and in fact those perspectives are being fed to us, only perspectives that validate our feelings, validate our interests, validate our default values, and validate our privilege in some cases. It's a great question, and it harkens, I don't know if you've seen the film, The Social Network. You'll want to deactivate all your social media accounts, but it's an interesting example of the way, we literally computer algorithms are feeding us information and perspectives that validate our pre-existing perspectives. Well, that's not civil debate, right? That's not civic engagement. That's that's simply cocooning yourself in confirming evidence of what you already believe.
But I think that to me, in fairness, we were doing that before there was computers, let alone Facebook.
Absolutely.
I mean, people were siloing themselves, and anybody that didn't agree with them, they didn't talk about it. I would say that's a classic problem in South Dakota. Having lived here for about 30 years, one of the things you can see is in so many towns, those towns are shrinking because if they have a disagreement with someone, their solution is to run them out of town, to make life so uncomfortable for them that they leave, or they don't accept. And I'm not saying that it's peculiar to South Dakota. I'm just saying we do it too, so we can watch it happen in motion. Even when our young kids, they leave the town and the state to go find someplace else where they can be accepted. And with all the children we have, we should not be a state of under 1 million people. And we export our greatest commodity, and that's the kids that we've educated. And then so before the ink dries, they leave. So I would say that yes, Facebook is, not helping, but I think there's something underneath that I would like to get to, like, yeah, I call it the train yard effect, and the train yard effect is like if you're sitting in a train and there's a train next to you, when that train starts to move, you have the sensation that you're going backwards. And it's only when that train passes you, you realize you haven't moved at all.
Yeah.
It has not affected you. But when your point of reference is the train next to you, and that's all you can see. Sometimes even in your car, you can see the same thing if there's a large truck. It's the sensation the brain works on in terms of relativity. So you don't know how maybe to calibrate what's your position relative just to you. It's always relative to someone else. That's the way you formulate your relationship. So I've identified that, and I think that that's part of the complication in trying to determine what's my needs and what's my interest.
Yeah, and I think that I love the net, right? Right, that we're, I think the other thing that's happening, right, is you're perceiving someone else moving and you're right, it's this kind of comparative response.
Right.
Right. And I think that oftentimes, right, when we have a comparative response that suggests that some people are getting something we're not getting, or somehow that's a threat to us. I'm not sure. This is where I'm riffing in a way that your metaphor isn't going to work for, but that there is a perception that that's a threat, that somebody else has something that I don't have. I want it to, and so I'm not, that because of the threat, I'm not going to engage that community in conversation or anything like that.
Yes. Why do we default then, from your perspective? What are the things that happen that lead us to default to violence?
Again, I think that when you're in a situation where there's an asymmetric access to power, right, you get the advantaged group doesn't get anything really, right, only sees its continuing to disadvantage the other group, and sometimes they don't even grapple with it, right, that the advantage group has very little incentive to change. Why would you? Right? Why you might not see what you're doing as a problem, and you might not actually be consciously saying, well, I have certain advantages that are flowing my direction from this. That might not even be in at the top of your mind. It's just that, well, why I'm doing fine. Why should I worry about it? And the disadvantaged group, of course, sees it the opposite way. They often feel like they have little advantage or little opportunity for fighting the system except through violence, and that the way they get recognition, the way their cause becomes acknowledged, right, written up in the press, becomes part of public opinion, is through some level of public violence. I think we saw that this summer, right, where the violence in the Twin Cities and other cities around perceptions of police violence, right, and the need for police, the feeling that policing needed to be reformed. People felt like they had no other option but to go out and demonstrate in the streets. And then when they did, and they were responded to by different forms of authority, they felt like they had some, not all, but many felt like the only way to get attention to move forward was through violent action. Now, many times, I just want to play this. Sorry, Lawrence, to cut you off, but I think it's interesting too to think about like Martin Luther King, right, and the nonviolent protest movements in the 1960s. King's brilliance, at least in part, was because he recognized that kind of violent action wasn't a way forward, and he worked very, very hard to make sure that Blacks and African Americans demonstrated that all they wanted were the same rights that whites had, but they weren't going to engage in violence. They were going to engage in peaceful forms of protest. But King was not the only person, in that sort of field of social movements, right? There was the Nation of Islam and other movements that were much more interested in protracted violence as a way of gaining attention and really forcing the issue in a way that they saw was faster than King's nonviolent protest movements.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I gotta call a flag on that.
Go ahead.
Um, Hi, everybody. There's a lot of things that are like Ireland and so on, but there are a lot of things that will not track because
Absolutely.
here there were people taken and the culture removed and so on and so forth. And there was, when you're talking about King, there was no violence from folks down there because everybody knew they'd be lynched. And when you start speaking of Nation of Islam and like the movie when the man said that's too much power for one man and so on, people were afraid that Black folks were going to go ahead and start looting and doing and killing and so on and so forth. And basically what it was, you've been beating us. We're not going to stand for it anymore. We're not going to hurt you. We're not going to come for you. But when you come for me, I'm not just going to be your boy.
Right. All right. I mean, it was an acknowledgement that violence was a possible outcome. That's all I'm trying to say. I'm not trying to say that they were out there necessarily engaged in some level of, like the Irish Republican Army or various, unionist or loyalist paramilitary groups. But there was this acknowledgement that violence was an acceptable option under certain conditions. And that was a difference between, I think, King's movement and orientation and other movements within the civil rights movement. Or other groups.
The violence with Dr. King was perpetrated upon.
Absolutely.
And so,
and it caught media attention, which is what, which was the great power of that movement in many ways.
Mm-hmm. The only thing that just in defense, because I'm from Minneapolis, St. Paul, and I know a lot of the people that are over there, just to be clear, because it is going to probably be on the internet, which we all love forever. There were a lot of things that happened in Minneapolis and St. Paul that were different than the protests,
right,
at that time and at that juncture. And the rest of it, that's a whole nother discussion. But I just needed to call that. I just needed to call that.
Sure. Anyone else has a comment or a question? That's what we're here for.
Go ahead. Oh, yeah. I was not here for half an hour. I had a guest and I didn't want to interrupt them while I watched you. This discussion is basically based on groups and the anger. Is that correct? And the differences. And I'm looking at the problems that cause this. And I think using your semantics, us, them, our group against their group, goes down to the individuals. And I think it has to be a groundswell of individuals purposely looking to basically integrate knowledge between the two. An example might be in our division between two political parties, because the new nationwide campaign right now as we speak, and it's moving quickly, is called ranked choice voting. How many of you have heard about that? And that is more of us coming together, looking individually at it as opposed to a group. And if there's some way that groups can come to a consensus that this is a definitely need in our country, period, and openly listen to each other, whether it goes in groups like we have now as a forum, how you want to name the forum, that would be another group, I guess, but do that and start a groundswell of attempting this. Just an idea.
Yeah, I think the issue of ranked choice voting is in part going to, there's always room for grassroots movements, right? There's always room for people to be engaged politically, to be engaged in moving systems forward that promote equality and that promote a better, a more effective form of democracy and representation. But I think will also be groups who oppose those shifts, in part because they feel like their interests are being violated, right? They feel threatened. They have power. They don't, and this new, we don't know what to expect out of this new form of voting. That it may potentially create other forms of disagreement and power differences. And so, so they're always human being, right? People act in the context of these sort of advantages and disadvantages, perceived advantages and threats. And so I think you're absolutely right. The grassroots is super critical. And so is conversation, right? Mediation between groups who have different perspectives that allows us to get back to some sort of community dialogue over what is best for the country, not just an individual political or a group or a political party.
Charles, you had something you wanted to say?
Well, maybe just an observation. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I was involved in creating a peace and conflict studies program at SDHC. It's an interdisciplinary minor. And the origins of that 9/11, I was in conversation with my students, I guess as most other teachers were, trying to process what had happened and why. And it became fairly clear to me early on that my students had no frame of reference for alternative means of conflict resolution. They were unanimous, and I know heat of the moment for sure, or after the moment, but they're pretty much unanimous in the idea that violence must inevitably be responded to with violence. There were no nonviolent proponents in the discussion. And out of that, I started teaching honors courses and eventually got the idea of trying to create a program and got colleagues involved and so forth, and we did that. But I thought then, and I think now, that it's curious that there's not more intentional teaching of conflict resolution approaches, K through 12 and beyond. It just doesn't seem to be, maybe things have changed. Maybe our guests can tell us what's going on in response to recent years, the violence of recent years. But you would think that education from the beginning would forefront conflict resolution as foundational to everything else. And yet here, I had these college students who were very interested in discussing finding alternative means of conflict resolution, but it wasn't part of their way of thinking as we began those discussions.
Yeah, boy, I wish I had an answer for you. I don't know. We have seen, I think, an increase in the number of students who would be interested in some sort of peace studies or conflict resolution curriculum, major, minor, within at Augustana. I think we have disjointed courses that emphasize some of this content, but not currently a program. And I don't know that universities like us, there are many universities like us who have standalone programs. And you're absolutely correct about the sort of, K through 12 education and it not being something that's immediately present in in that curriculum as well. Why that is, I'm not entirely certain. I could sort of poke at why, but I don't know that I have any kind of definitive answer for that.
Well, would you think there'd be some kind of societal impetus in that direction? We've
Well,
got a societal problem. We need to educate our children from the earliest possible age that there are alternative means to conflict resolution, and yet we don't. In fact, I think we go in the other direction in many ways, where we emphasize competition, hyper competition. In fact, I have thought often about America's obsession with athletics, with sports, and wondered how that plays into all of this. You know, this morning in the paper, I read a story about death threats being received by athletes in the college basketball tournament. Their star athletes on teams lost, early round games. These kids are receiving death threats. And, it's just so out of perspective, I think. You can make an argument for the value of competition, but I think that in many cases, in many instances, it creates hyper competitive attitudes, which contribute to violence. Violence in America, maybe, I think, has something to do with how we are about sports, because sports is everything to us.
I think, Charles, I think you're really hitting on something, and that is, again, I sound a bit like a broken record, but this idea of what values do we default to? And competition is definitely one of them that we default to in our culture. Individualism is another. And so, we have this, and so how could we be in a position where we think critically about those values and try to think about what other values might be equally important, if not perhaps more productive, for community life in the United States. And one of the places to do that is in early childhood education, right? If we're going to re-socialize, or if we're going to socialize people into a set of values that promote things like equality, promote collective engagement, promote civic discourse, community dialogue, those kinds of things. The place to start with that is at a very young age, because once those values become ingrained in people, once people go through what social scientists call primary socialization, it's increasingly difficult to undo those sort of values that people carry with them through the rest of their lives. And so your example about the death threats being received by athletes who've lost a game suggests that the power of competition as a value of American society has these really, really negative implications, and we ought to be having conversations about why that's the case, and trying to figure out a more productive way, a more productive value set than that.
Sports Illustrated did a feature story many years ago about fan violence. And it's interesting to consider the consequences of spectator sports, whether they're cathartic, you sit in the stands and cheer for your team and put all kinds of positive energy into that, or provocative. And even these many years ago, Sports Illustrated was suggesting that, to some extent, sports sometimes are provocative. You don't go to a football game and scream, "Finesse them," do you? So, I'm not anti-sport. I was a participant and am still a fan to some extent, but it occurs to me that America has a problem with overemphasis on athletics, and the extent to which athletics promotes hyper-competitive attitudes. I'll say one other quick thing. Small town rivals. Their towns hate each other because of competition. Little rural towns who are kind of on the outs. You can't trust people from so and so, uh, which has athletic competition is foundational to that. You know, that's the conflict between them, which is unresolved. You know, where does that come from?
And I think you hit on something really important. I don't think it's just the case in the United States. I think we can look across to all sorts of other European countries, for example, or other countries generally, that where, you know, the sort of tribalism that emerges from athletic participation and team sports, particularly, and one's identity with one's team, has is a kind of, like you say, a kind of it perpetuates violence in some cases, right? And then you get caught up in the emotional experience of the game, and you're surrounded by people who are in the same fan tribe as you are, you know, and it's a kind of powder keg. It has the potential to be a powder keg for conflict.
Yeah, I'm curious about something Lawrence said earlier about having experience of cultures where this competitiveness wasn't there.
Yeah.
Lawrence,
Okay,
what's with those cultures? I mean, how is it that they aren't conditioned to these kinds of behaviors in contrast to Americans, for example?
so I lived in West Africa for 3 years. And one of the things that I noticed pretty quickly is that everything was kind of considered community property. If you had a bicycle and somebody needed a bicycle, often even without saying anything, they would take the bicycle, and nobody called the cops or made a big deal about it, because even though you bought the bicycle, nobody used the bicycle unless they really needed it. If they really needed it, and you could go and get your bicycle, or somebody would bring that bicycle back. People, even so far as people didn't buy a pack of cigarettes. They bought one cigarette at a time. And then everybody had a cigarette. If somebody bought a pack, then everybody would bum off that guy. We call it bumming. They just call it sharing until there was no more. And then they would give him a cigarette. But it was never a sense that, and he didn't feel, or I never saw an exhibition of any feelings that somehow everybody's taking advantage of me, because there was a sense that what I have is yours. I think they say Ubuntu. It's like there's a sense that I exist because of we, you know. It's like I only exist because I'm part of this. It's kind of a discontiguous organism, if you will. Is that no more than you would see, well, I have to favor my eye over my nose.
Mm.
It's just
That
all,
is
it's all the same.
conversation for the future.
Mhm.
Competition versus cooperation. And I had lectures from Ashley Montague, a great writer, and Margaret Mead's daughter, and worldwide, the same discussion, competition versus cooperation, and looking at peoples of the world. Great conversation today.
Yeah,
Thank
and
you.
I think it's a great example, and I think that oftentimes we say, you know, we're our value of competition is so ingrained, so we just say, well, that's just part of human nature. Humans are just competitive. Well, it's not, right? We see example after example. I mean, we have our neighbors in South Dakota, right? Indigenous communities in South Dakota have an ethic of generosity that runs through traditional Native American culture, where, you know, the way you become upwardly mobile, I'm going to use that language, right? The way you gain social status is through generosity, not through accumulation. It's a very, very different perspective than in our Western culture. And I think it feeds, you know, those kinds of, your language, Lawrence, is brilliant, right? It's not bumming, it's sharing. Wow. Talk about the loaded meaning of those two concepts, right? The difference between what that is and the different perspective and the different sort of normative standards and morals that they suggest are part of, you know, you asking for a cigarette from someone else. It's very laden with values.
Yeah, that was just one of the many, many, many different ways that I observed that people felt like I am you and you are me and we are all in this together. And it wasn't kind of a political or philosophical approach. It's just, that's what you grew up with. You really didn't know another way to look at life, and any other way just left you feeling empty and alone.
And that's what we mean by default values, right? That they're so ingrained in us that we don't really ever think about them unless we're forced to think about them. You were forced to think about your own default values by living in West Africa, right?
Exactly.
I'm forced to think about my own values every time I meet with, American Indian people or people living on the reservation. It's just, otherwise I just keep sort of doing the thing I do. And, because I've been socialized to think that way and to therefore act that way. Your example earlier too about, ignoring the community means when you need your house built, well, no one's going to show up. So the community is like this big bank account that you make deposits into and take withdrawals from, except nobody's keeping a ledger.
That's right.
Right. Nobody's
there's actually an African proverb that goes, the best place to store food is in my neighbor's stomach.
That's fascinating.
I just like to, we're getting near the end here of our conversation. And I just like to offer something that was taught to me a long time ago about starting your baseline of what you believe and how you act, especially in a crisis, at a very young age or at the beginning of something. A long time ago, when I was in radio, one of the guys who was my engineer, he was had a side business of salvage diving, and so he was telling me about it, and I said, "Wow, that'd be a fascinating thing. I'd love to do that." And he said, and I said, "But I'm negative buoyant and I can't swim. I know how to swim, but because I'm negative buoyant, I can take a full lung of air and drop like a rock right down to the bottom." At that time, I'm fatter now, so I float. but at any rate, I said, "So I have to learn how to swim first." He said, "Oh, actually, you're better off learning first how to dive. Because if you learn how to dive, when you get into trouble, you will act like a diver and you will survive. If you learn how to swim first, when you get into trouble, you will act like a swimmer and you will drown because you can't act like a swimmer underwater." And that had a lot of deep meaning for me about how it's not something that in a crisis, especially, or when you feel threatened, you revert to your baseline because a lot of your cognitive processing power is impaired. And so you go further down the rabbit hole of your default. So if you have at your core that this is how I see life, even if you thought something different, you will act in that way because that's who you are, not what you think. And so that's where I would like to get as far as like with reacting to violence, is looking at how we are, who are the people, who are we as a person and as a people in terms of violence? What's our baseline, and how do we fix that thing so that when there's violence, we have a whole reaction that's already set because that's what we do, but it's not violent. We're not turning to violence to deal with violence. It's been a wonderful conversation. I want to thank everybody for participating with us, and thank you very much, Will Swart. And I look forward to having more conversations. Maybe we'll get together and have some coffee or something when I'm down there.
I'd love it.
Yeah.
I love it. This has been really, really fun. Thank you for the opportunity.
Well, thanks, everybody. We'll see you next week, same time, same station.